Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line. We start out in the Kherson region where we see that the Russian forces launched counterattacks in the direction of Krinky, trying to recapture the position after the Ukrainian forces managed to make some landings here a couple of months ago. So we see that the Ukrainian forces still have a significant presence here across the Dnipro River with their positions in Krinky and the forest areas to the south of it staying in the gray zone. But the Russian forces started counterattacks in the direction of the village to try and gain control over it and prevent the Ukrainians from establishing their positions here. The fighting taking place here consists of three parts. The first part is the Ukrainian efforts to gaining positions in the area, so they have to continuously launch supplies to across the river line as well as reinforcements to fortify their positions, establish themselves in the area, and expand their zone of control so that they're able to properly start an offensive operations in this direction. So far, the situation in Krinky is, according to Putin, a PR stunt for the Ukrainian forces to make it seem like they're trying something in this direction. However, he's obviously biased. So what we are seeing is that the Ukrainian forces continuously use speedboats to cross over the Dnipro River, send supplies and reinforcements to the area, and establish their positions, trying to fortify it and gain full control over it as they build up men and supplies. The Russian, as this is the second part of the fighting that is taking place in the area, the Russian forces launch counterattacks. They want to regain control over the area and prevent the Ukrainian forces from establishing positions in the area. The third one is the fighting that takes place with the Ukrainian forces trying to cross over. Whenever they cross over, Russian artillery, Russian air force, etc., all try to shoot down the speedboats, because that is when the Ukrainians are the most vulnerable when they're crossing the river. Once they are across and have arrived at Krinky, they are much safer. So the current situation is that the Ukrainians have this area in Krinky, they're fortifying it, and they're constantly receiving supplies from across the river line, while the Russian forces are trying to regain control over the area and constantly attacking the Ukrainian supply lines towards Krinky, as well as launching operations in the area. We then move on to Novomykhailivka here to the southwest of Donetsk, where we see the Russian forces have managed to gain further access towards Novomykhailivka. They managed to capture this graveyard here to the south of the city, and with this they are now very close to the outskirts of the city from the southeastern direction. With this, we see continuous assaults by the Russian forces where they managed to attack this area on the 15th, which is 2 days ago, this area on the 14th, which is 3 days ago, this area on the 11th, which was 6 days ago, and this one today. So with this, we see that the Russian forces continuously launch these assaults to try and advance towards the city of Novomykhailivka, and they're getting closer and closer each day. With this, we see that the fighting is taking place very heavily as the Russian forces launch armored assaults as well as assault groups with their stormtroopers towards the Ukrainian positions in the area, and the Ukrainians are holding their defensive positions with trenches, fortifications all throughout the city as they send more reinforcements to deal with the situation as the Russian forces are putting heavy pressure in the area. The pressure here is kind of a diversion from Uledar. They've attempted multiple times to gain control over Uledar, however it has failed every time. The focus has now been diverted to Novomykhailivka as Russian forces managed to gain full control over Marinka. As such, they can now divert their forces southwards in this direction of Novomykhailivka. If the Russian forces manage to gain control over Novomykhailivka, they'll push further westwards towards Konstantinivka, and gaining control over Konstantinivka would allow them to move southern direction in the direction of Uledar. There will also be less supply lines for Uledar itself, and with all of these developments, it would eventually end up with Uledar being isolated and much easier for the Russian forces to take control over the city. So with all of this, this is all one big picture of how the Russian forces are going to break through the current Ukrainian defensive lines. Because the current Ukrainian defensive line spans a very vast distance within the Donetsk region. We have the front line defenses, which spans from Velika Novosilka here in the southwest of the Donetsk region towards Uladar, up to Novomykhailivka, Marinka, Krasnoarivka, through Pervomaiske to Avdiivka, back and above to New York, Toretsk, Chesevyar, the Konstantinivka, Kramatorsk, Sloviansk line, up to Liman, going down to Siversk, as well as up in the northern direction towards the villages here in the area, the Oskar River line, the Serebets River line, and Kupiansk. So that is the Ukrainian defensive lines here in the Donbass/Kharkiv region, all the way from Kupiansk through the Oskar River line down to Siversk, through Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinivka, New York, Avdiivka, all the way down south to Velika Novosilka. All of this is a singular defensive line, essentially. It is similar to the Russian Surovikin line, as they call it. However, it is not in the sense of being the same. Trenches, dragon teeth, dug-ins, all of these things, anti-tank ditches. Instead, it is natural fortifications, geographical advantages, trenches, bunkers, concrete fortifications, and so on, with the heaviest fortified area being Avdiivka. If we zoom in, we see the military base here to the southwest, trenches, rocks, more trenches, dug-ins to provide cover from the south, ditches built to provide cover for tanks, all of these fortifications in a small area. This is why, and this is what allows the Ukrainian forces to have this position right next to Opitne, despite Russian forces continuously pressuring the Ukrainian forces in the area. In the direction of Severne, we see this one and this one as well, both providing cover, trenches, tank ditches for cover for the tanks, in deeper trenches, forest lines, geographical advantages. Same with this one. As for the southeast of Avdiivka, constant trenches that spans kilometers. We have one that goes through the southeastern parts right here, going through and by the road all the way up to the Ukrainian positions within the residential dacha area here to the south of the city. The industrial zone was filled with fortifications as well. So we see how heavily fortified Avdiivka is. This is the south. This is what we can see with the satellite imagery. In the north, there's also a lot. However, it hasn't been updated with more recent satellite imagery. There are tunnels. There are ambush positions. There's so much fortifications in the Avdiivka area that there's nothing like it in all of Ukraine. We then move on to the Bakhmut direction, where it has been reported that a lot of fighting has taken place here by the Klishchivka direction, and with the Russian control over the fortifications here to the northwest of the village, the Ukrainian forces have been forced to withdraw from the northern parts of the village, as well as from the heights to the east of it, to avoid getting encircled and getting punished for the lack of supplies. The forest area here to the west of the village is also under constant attacks by Russian forces as they try to gain full control over it, with the constant advances by the Russian forces in the direction of the west of the village. They seem to be trying to advance in the direction of the canal line, cutting off the Ukrainian forces here in the south. This is why we're seeing a lot of fighting here in the forest area, as the Ukrainian forces are trying to buy time for a potential retreat here out of Klishchivka and the south by Andreevka to try and gain their positions by the canal line. So all of this pressure here by Bakhmut puts the Ukrainians in a very difficult position after their long offensive, leaving them weak and vulnerable to Russian counterattacks, which is why we've seen these advances by the Russian forces. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.